we're going to apply bias binding to one of our seams. So different seams are and different ways are used to finish a seam in a garment. Basically, as you can see here, the raw edges of fabric just continue to ravel and ravel and ravel. So in order for us to prevent this raveling in the garment, we finish all of these raw edges inside of a garment. And there are different applications depending on the type of garment and what you are sewing. So one way to finish edges, which is typical for jackets, if a jacket doesn't have a lining, you don't want to see all these raw edges inside of a jacket. So one way is to wrap and finish these raw edges. And you're going to use pre-bought, extra wide, double fold bias tape. And these packs come with 3 yards in them. And I've got some here that I'm pulling out. And we're going to actually, on this piece, so I have you cut pieces 7 inches by 12. And we are going to sew along the 12-inch length of one of the pieces. So you will open it up and we're going to sew along the 12-inch length. So let me show you this bias tape because it actually does something pretty neat. Bias means that the fabric is not on grain, it's on the bias, it's on the diagonal. This fabric has been cut on the bias. We could make our own bias tape. We're not going to make our own bias tape. We're going to use pre-purchased bias tape. And as you can see, once I open it, it's already folded. Once I open it, it is quite wide. And so the folding is very precise and it's very interesting on a bias tape. So you can see here that the size is 1 3/4 inches wide, this tape. It gets folded in half and then it gets folded again. However, when you look at your bias tape, you will notice that on one side, these two edges don't meet exactly. So if I turn it on the other side, you don't see one edge of the fabric of the tape. But if you look at it on the other side, you're seeing one edge, and that's deliberate. That's not an accident. Mine looks exactly like yours, looks exactly like anybody that buys bias tape. And the purpose of this is so that this edge gets to be the edge that would be on top of the fabric, so that you would be sewing right along this edge, and that would capture the other side. So when you're getting ready to sew your bias tape, you're going to line up your tape with the edge of the fabric. So the edge of the tape lines up with the raw edge of the fabric. And this might be one of those times where you want to pin it in place, because it is just going to try to move and not line up and not stay lined up. So once you line up the edge of your tape with the edge of your fabric, you are going to sew along this first fold line. So you're going to line up your sewing and you're going to sew the length, the 12-inch length of your fabric that you've cut, and you're going to line these up and you're going to sew along that length. Again, always start with your back stitch, and you're going to take your time keeping these lined up. And again, with my camera, I'm sort of sitting sideways to my sewing machine, but I shouldn't have too much trouble. And you're going to slowly sew so that edge of tape and edge of fabric are lined up. So as you can see, as I roll it up, I make sure that these two edges are lined up. And that's important that you sew exactly inside of this line. Not good if you go towards the center. That will create problems. And my hands constantly guide my sewing. Your hands are there. They require you to guide your sewing at all times. When I get to my end here, I'm going to back stitch. And I'm going to, my edge of my fabric and the edge of my tape are completely lined up. And then I'm going to cut my tape, lining it up with the edge of the fabric. So I'm going to make sure that I have a nice clean line here. Once that is sewn down, you are going to then take your tape and you are going to wrap it around your raw edge of fabric. And in essence, you are now going to encase that raw edge. So imagine this is a jacket and you don't want to see all these raw threads just sticking up everywhere. And now you are sewing on the longer part. We started on the shorter part. Let me show you that again. I lined up the side that doesn't meet the edge, and I started with that side, not on the longer side, not the side that goes past the edge. I started on the shorter side. You always start on the shorter side. So now that longer side is going to go beyond my stitching line. That's why we have a longer side. And I'm going to trim my threads. Keep your work clean. I don't want to pull my fabric where it doesn't need to be pulled. And now, because I'm on my longer side, I'm going to start sewing along the edge here. I'm going to back stitch. I'm going to make sure that my fabric is completely inside, laying flat inside of this bound edge. So binding happens on jackets, on the seams inside jackets. It also you can also find binding on blankets. So the top edge often has a satin binding. You will find binding on quilts. Again, back stitch, and I'm sewing very, very slowly, making sure that I capture, and I'm sewing on the very edge of my bias tape, and that my bias tape, in fact, is hiding my previous stitched line. So don't get in a hurry. This isn't work that goes fast. You've not been doing this for 10, 20, 30 years. You want to get it right, and you want to make sure that nothing pulls out. I've got some extra threads here on the other end that I'm going to clean away before I get to those ends, so that my work is completely clean and neat. Don't pull on your fabric. You don't want to pull from behind. You hear my hands always stay in the front, and I keep my fabric straight from the front side. Stop, reorganize before you pick up sewing again. If something isn't lined up right, stop, straighten it out before you continue to sew. Don't try to fix it after the fact. After the fact is often too late. And I have a little thread poking out right there. Keep my fingers out of the way. Now let my machine do the rest. I'm going to back stitch. And here I have sewn along the very edge, all the way along the very edge, but it's sewn down. I can't open it anywhere. It is all sewn down and it is finished. And I have now completely enclosed my seam, so I have no raw edges on this seam. So if this is a garment, it's all finished. Now, if you were sewing a garment itself, you would have sewn a 5/8 seam allowance, and then you will enclose each one of these seam allowances with the tape. So if we can take our samples here, for instance, and I have a sample seam. After I've sewn my seam, I would then enclose each one of these seams individually, and you can see that the tape is on the edge and you still have your seam, but you would do that on this seam and then you'd come back and do that on that seam. So that is how you would finish a seam on some types of garments, or on a quilt, or on a blanket. Anytime you have fabric that you have to enclose your seam, this is how you would do it. So there you have it, all your seams all enclosed and finished.